Hi everyone, my name is Martin Köring. I'm Senior Manager in the Policy and Insights team at Economist Impact. Welcome to today's webinar. We will discuss the key findings from our latest research on the ESG Conundrum, how investors and companies can find common purpose in ESG. And I will be joined today by Candice de Montpetit. She's a manager in the Policy and Insights team at Economist Impact. And after the presentation, we will speak with Stuart, a partner at Baillie Gifford. So this is a study that we did at Economist Impact to investigate how investors and companies can find common purpose in ESG, supported by Baillie Gifford. And thanks a lot, everyone, for sending in your questions as well that we will discuss later on. So just a couple of words on Economist Impact. So Economist Impact is part of the Economist Group. I'm very excited that we set up this new business unit last year to bring together the rigor of a think tank with the creativity of a media brand to kind of really engage global influential audiences through Economist Impact. So in terms of the structure of the conversation today, so we will start with the key metrics and the kind of the research program, how we set up the research, and how we designed the research, and then we'll talk a little bit about the key findings from the study before moving on to actually really going into the findings, and Candice will help us really looking at each of those key findings. So first of all, defining ESG metrics, then looking at the alignment and whether there is an alignment for good between investors and corporates. Then we will look at the positive feedback loop that is emerging. And we will move on to discussing, how do we get from metrics to stewardship, and finally looking at how to improve disclosure and engagement. And we will then kind of conclude on, the key takeaways, and then we'll of course have our conversation with Stuart. So just in terms of the research itself and how we designed the research. So the objective of the research was to explore the potential disconnect between investors and corporates in terms of the perceptions around ESG metrics and how to achieve real world impact. And in terms of the methodology, so we conducted two global surveys, one with 300 institutional investors and the other one with 313 corporate decision makers, half of which from the C-suite, and including a range of industries. And on that basis, we created a white paper with 5 expert interviews. And here you can see the people that we interviewed. We wanted to make sure that we interview a globally representative group of experts, as well as different parts of the investor and corporate spectrum. So first of all, we had Jane Firth, the head of responsible investing at Border to Coast Pension Partnership. We spoke with Richard James, Sustainable Client Solutions Director at JLL, and Kirsty Jenkinson, Director for Sustainable Investment and Stewardship Strategies at CalSTRS, and Stéphane Monnier, Chief Investment Officer at Lombard Odier Private Bank, and last but not least, Richard Rui Sheng, the Director of Group ESG Office at Ping An. So as you can see, we had a global group representing different parts of the conversation. And in terms of what we found, and we will get into the nitty-gritty of those findings later, but first of all, just broadly, the key findings. So first of all, we found a general alignment between investors and companies, which is, of course, very encouraging when it comes to ESG metrics. But then we looked a little bit deeper, and there are actually significant gaps in ESG reporting. And there is this risk that there is actually an echo chamber of investors and corporates, and we explored that further. And one of the key ways of dealing with that is through more bottom-up approaches. So looking at how to really achieve real-world impact is through stewardship and engagement, and we look at that in the study. And finally, we analyzed different regulations and the different frameworks that are emerging, particularly with a focus on the kind of standardization that is still needed. So now I'd like to hand over to Candice to discuss the first finding of our study, looking at how to define ESG metrics.
Hello, everyone. First, I'd like us to have a look at the landscape for ESG reporting. A study found that 80% of the largest 100 companies in 52 countries now actually report on sustainability. But what's actually featured in these reports varies quite a lot. And so this is due to the fact that there's a very, very large number of ESG frameworks. There were more than 600 as of 2020. And this makes it both challenging for companies who want to report on ESG, and it's also confusing for investors trying to assess ESG performance. So we can see here that SASB, which is the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, is the preferred framework for investors. And it also happens to be the one most used by companies. And both state that they really like the SASB's sector-specific approach to metrics. And there's currently a push to consolidate frameworks. SASB and the IIRC, which is the International Integrated Reporting Council, merged last year to become the Value Reporting Foundation, the VRF. And in June this year, the VRF and the Climate Disclosure Standards Board will consolidate again into the International Sustainability Standards Board, ISSB, which will also include technical frameworks from TCFD, which is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. But according to our research, companies seem a bit skeptical about the creation of yet another framework from scratch. So the good news is that companies are disclosing and consolidation is happening, but as we'll see later on, there's no silver bullet.
Yes, and here we can see, a little bit more kind of flavor around the, some of those findings that Candice mentioned. Particularly here we have this quote from Richard James from JLL, focusing on the need for, corporates to, to embrace these kind of regulatory clarity and guidance. I mean, what is really needed is this kind of consistency and consolidation of metrics is happening, but of course it takes time. And actually JLL, and what we analyzed in our study as well, is doing some really exciting work around this in terms of investor expectation analysis, for example. So in terms of the next finding, I'll hand back to Candice.
Yeah, so next on to the sentiment about ESG metrics. Well, our study finds that there's a general alignment between investors and companies when it comes to metrics. Both broadly agree that existing metrics are fit for purpose and that they meet their needs. Also, investors report being confident in the robustness of ESG data, and companies on their side are confident that their choice of metrics suit their shareholders and investors. But actually, if you have a closer look at these 17 ESG metrics, only 10 are actually published by at least half of companies. So there seems to be a bit of a disconnect here. Also, we can see here that the two most commonly published metrics are health and safety records and product safety records. And while these tend to be operational indicators that are straightforward for companies to measure, so where are the more complicated ones, the ones that are more interconnected? So the question here is, does following these frameworks and reporting on ESG metrics promote actual impact, or is it placing investors and companies in an echo chamber? Or maybe put more simply, is all of this just a giant box ticking exercise?
And to put more flavor around this finding that Candice just mentioned, here we have a quote from Phil Redmond from OneTrust. And here it's really, as you can see, focusing on, the need to look a little bit, at each organization itself. There is, of course, that alignment around ESG priorities, but there's still this, variability going on. There's lots of flexibility still. And that really shows the importance of engagement. And that's something that we really analyze in our study, and Candice will talk about in the next couple of findings. So now on to the next one, which is about the positive feedback loop that is emerging.
Yeah, so next I'd like to discuss another quite interesting finding from our research. It's the fact that there's a positive correlation between the level of corporate disclosure in ESG and investor confidence in these metrics. So it's basically the higher the level of confidence, the higher the level of disclosure, the higher the confidence. And As you can see here, companies and the US and in Asia Pacific have general high levels of disclosure. And we can note that this wasn't the case 10 years ago, for example. And they also have high levels of investor confidence, whereas the UK lags on both fronts. So this tells us that regulation is needed to push companies to disclose, and this in turn is bound to increase investor confidence.
And here we can actually see a quote that highlights some of those, those findings, particularly around the UK lagging behind. I mean, when it comes to the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures that Candice mentioned, TCFD, there is that, that lag shown, and this is particularly because larger corporates and larger companies are kind of changing first in the UK, and it does take time to pass on to other corporates. So this quote by Richard James highlights that that there is that that medium-term switch, and it does take time. And in the UK, you can particularly see that, and that might explain that lag that Candice mentioned. So on to the next finding.
Yes, now let's have a look at the importance of stewardship. So that's investor-company dialogue. Well, our study finds that for 9 out of the 12 main ESG metrics, investors preferably measure performance by engaging directly with companies. Also, as you can see here on the chart, direct engagement is viewed as key to the implementation of ESG agendas for both companies and investors. And indeed, there is a need for engagement to identify these ESG priorities and the key action points at an individual company level. So this tells us that rather than relying on a top-down approach involving solely metrics, investors need to also take a bottom-up approach if they want to achieve actual impact.
And here we see from Stéphane Monnier, who we interviewed for the study as well, from Lombard Odier, that it's more a question of looking at companies in a forward-looking way, and it just highlights this need to be able to revisit business models, so really being able to kind of look at take a step back and look at this from a more fundamental, holistic approach, and also from a kind of a forward-looking perspective. So finally, Candice will talk about improving disclosure and engagement.
Yeah, so how can investors and company truly move the needle? Well, regulation is key. We have more than 8 in 10 investors who believe government regulation is needed to mandate companies to disclose more information. However, at the moment, this regulation applies only to listed companies. So this doesn't prevent the so-called harmful assets or dirty assets being taken over by private entities that are much less accountable. Also, who should be deciding what's material? Well, for a third of companies and nearly half of investors, it's a dedicated regulator, such as the US's Environmental Protection Agency, who should be in charge of this. And when it comes to engagement, there are guidelines for stewardship, such as the FRC's Stewardship Code in the UK. You also have the framework for US stewardship and governance. But most frameworks remain voluntary. So, first of all, we need regulation on disclosure that should apply to both public and private companies. And secondly, we need more binding requirements when it comes to stewardship. And these guidelines should include how investors and companies can determine proper milestones and also how they can track progress against these targets. And it's that way that investors and companies will be able to find actual common purpose in ESG.
And here is a quote that highlights, what really needs to happen next. And Candice mentioned that, there is that need to look more at this, combining this bottom up with the top down approach. And here from Kirsty Jenkinson, from CASAS, we heard that, what is really needed and what is important is that supportive framework and, building on the existing frameworks that regulators are doing. And we talked about the standardization and consolidation of frameworks such as, the Value Reporting Foundation, and to really move the needle in this regard. So I'd like to summarize some of the findings that Candice and I talked about in the study. So first of all, what we have seen is that companies increasingly see the importance of a strong ESG agenda for their long-term strategy. It's really important to have that long view, and they're really expanding their measurement and publication of different metrics. We've seen this consolidation of ESG frameworks. You mentioned some of those exciting developments, such as the International Sustainability Standards Board and others that give real hope of an international standard for disclosures emerging. Of course, there's still this this need for transparency and reporting, but that will not achieve real world impact on their own. I mean, we need this bottom up approach that we talked about that includes engagement and stewardship to address individual companies' issues. And of course, proper binding requirements are needed still in many jurisdictions, as we found in our study, to promote this kind of setting of milestones, tracking of progress, but really to have a more meaningful, impactful investor stewardship program. There needs to be, this kind of combination of, bringing together, the bottom up and the top down approaches that we talked about. So in terms of finding out more about the full study, you can see here the website where we published the full findings of the study, including an infographic that summarizes the results, as well as a full white paper that discusses the survey results, that brings in all of those interview insights and more that we highlighted. And now I'm very excited to discuss our research findings with our guest today, Stuart Dunbar, partner at Baillie Gifford. Hi, Stuart. Great to have you with us today. I'd like to talk to you about the key findings from our study and, of course, the future you see for ESG metrics, the investor-corporate relationship, and also, of course, very importantly, the role of engagement in particular. We have received lots of questions from the audience ahead of the webinar. And thanks a lot, everyone, for sending your questions in. And I will aim to weave as many of these into our conversation. So without further ado, let's start with the first part of the conversation, defining ESG metrics. I mean, as we heard from Candice in terms of the study, there is a lot of, there are a lot of frameworks around, there's lots of consolidation happening with the Value Reporting Foundation, the International Sustainability Standards Board happening, and there's a lot of focus on that consolidation. So Stuart, I wanted to know, from your perspective, I mean, which ESG metrics does Baillie Gifford consider the most relevant for investment processes? And do you get any kind of requests from your clients on preferred frameworks or guidelines?
Yeah, thanks, Martin. I guess I should start by saying thanks everyone for listening in, and it's been fun working with you guys on this project. Defining ESG metrics. I think our starting point here, and this will be probably a recurring theme of our conversation, is that ESG metrics are useful. We do use them, but I think it's absolutely crucial that everybody understands they are inputs to an investment process and often the starting point for an investigation rather than metrics and targets in themselves. And I think that's a really important point, which we'll no doubt come on and talk about. In terms of what we think about within Baillie Gifford, so as inputs to our process, there are some fairly things. Carbon footprint, generally greenhouse gas emissions, are universally things we'd be interested in, although not equally impactful, of course, across all our different investment deliberations. Increasingly, you mentioned clients. Our clients very much are asking us about things like supply chain policies. There are policies in the world, starting in Australia, but elsewhere now, about ensuring no modern slavery in supply chains, that sort of stuff. It's not enough, by the way, to just have, let's go and see if a company has a policy. I think there's much more to it than that. We have to engage with companies and see how they're actually implementing on those policies. Health and safety and accident rates are things that we will often talk to companies about. Product safety, labour, and tax practices. In fact, very often we encourage clients to pay more tax, not less, because we think that that's in their own long-term interests to do so. So I guess the key point here is there's some fairly straightforward metrics, but it's not a case of what's good or bad. It's a case of how does this impact for individual companies. And in terms of our client preferences, they generally do like it if we're signed up to the various different bodies that set standards here. So we were very early in UNPRI, for example. But there are many other sort of industry bodies that we are not only part of, but sometimes have engaged in trying to set standards through. And because we do that, I think our clients in the main are happy to leave us to exercise our judgment with regard to how we incorporate metrics into our investment decision-making processes. And that's the way we like it, because I think to sort of outsource ESG or to outsource voting or anything is, to us, not part of it. It all has to be pretty seriously integrated into decision-making processes.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks a lot, Stuart, for highlighting that integrated process, but also the focus on impact, as you said, and you're part of industry bodies to accelerate that. I mean, one of the things, as you know from our study that we found, is that there is this general kind of alignment in terms of broad agreement, among corporates as well as investors, that the kind of existing ESG metrics are fit for purpose and that the metrics are robust. So I wanted to kind of question that. I mean, in terms of what you are seeing in your view, do you believe current ESG frameworks are really fit for purpose? And what is your view on the current push for this kind of consolidation of frameworks?
Yeah, and I found the survey results to be both good and bad in this respect, because it depends what do you mean by fitness for purpose. So if you think that ESG metrics are a fairly straightforward measure to indicate the way that a company is conducting itself, then probably the 15 or so metrics that are in the survey, and some are more commonly reported than others, they do a reasonable job of that. In terms of the standardization of these metrics, it's got to be a good thing. I mean, we're very much in the camp that think ISSB efforts to standardize some of these reporting metrics can only be good because it gives us a standard starting point for assessing what companies are up to. So if that's what fitness for purpose means, then okay. I think there's a much deeper element to this, and actually I was mildly surprised, which we might come into, is the geographic spread of some of these responses. So I find it strange, frankly, that we have in the US and Asia Pacific much higher degrees of confidence in both accuracy and fitness for purpose of ESG metrics, but we didn't see that so much coming out of Europe and the UK. And that's odd, because our experience is very definitely that it's Europe that's leading the way on trying to fully integrate ESG considerations and actually tackle some of these E&S challenges. That is the whole point of the exercise. I think what's going on is that different parts of the world are at different stages in their understanding of how ESG actually needs to be properly and thoughtfully integrated into decisions that are made both within companies and within asset managers. So some interesting stuff coming out of it. But maybe the most important point I would make here is it's what these frameworks don't capture that is primarily of interest and a concern to me. So there's nothing wrong with what we have. Let's remember, nobody talks about anything other than ESG these days, it seems, but we're still quite early in this journey. What we've not got in place are metrics that look on a much more system-wide basis about what is the real impact that a company is having on the world or in the economy in which it operates, or wherever it may be. And what I'm talking about there is things like future avoided emissions, for example. Do we have some methodology for that? Because depending on what the purpose of a company is, it's the impact of what it makes may be a great deal more important than the way that it conducts itself. Not to say that these micro-level ESG measures, such as board diversity, for example, are not important, but we have to keep in clear perspective what is the most important thing for each individual company. And that purpose point, I think, is really not captured anywhere in ESG frameworks at the moment.
Yeah, that's a great point, Stuart, in terms of, the metrics are there, they are kind of expanding in terms of adoption, and the frameworks are consolidating, but are they really measuring what is required in terms of system-wide impact, as you mentioned, future avoided emissions? And
I think there's one other thing I'll jump in. One other thing, I think the starting point of this stuff is really important. So we have to think about ESG as a process of improvement, not a series of absolutes. And that sort of, people need to understand that. So if you invest in a company which is necessary but polluting, you have huge scope for improvement. You may be able to bring about change. This relates to perhaps a later discussion about the value of divestment. But it's really important to focus on that. The starting point is the starting point. It's a fact. And if you can understand that, where you are and where you're trying to get to, what you can focus on is the process of improvement rather than some sort of snapshot carbon target relative to a benchmark or something, which is not really, in my opinion, focusing on the right thing, which is the journey towards, net zero and greater social equality.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, that is often forgotten. When ESG is looked at, it's actually about improving, these kind of real world indicators. You mentioned the geography and the kind of geographical split and divergence. Then we actually had really interesting questions from the audience on that. I mean, we had a question here: how should, if at all, the weight between the E, S, and G factors change depending on geography? Should the social part of it have more weight in areas with a low human development index, for example? What is your view on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's really important. Yes, it should change, I believe, depending on geography, and probably more than that. It's really a question about stages of development of individual countries, I think. What's achievable in terms of E is very largely determined by what's affordable in the circumstances of whichever E it is that you're where and what you're trying to address. So there are parts of the world in which I think it's wholly unrealistic to expect people to be worrying about the environment, the state of the world in 30 years' time, when actually the challenge is, am I warm enough or cool enough and have I got enough food type of stuff. So, nobody in those circumstances is going to give up standard of living on the basis that the air might be a bit nicer 40 years down the line. And I don't mean to cheapen that in any way. That's just the reality. So, of course, in those kinds of circumstances, the S takes on a much more pressing importance than the E does. And so, just to give one obvious example of that, if a country requires to build its infrastructure to raise its level of wealth to a point where they can start to afford about the E, then you might actually see a pretty large carbon footprint in the meantime, unless we can find, better ways of creating concrete, etc. So this is a really good example, probably, of the need for context and systems thinking. And then we can go one step further than that. In more developed economies, we do have these challenges too. So, one of the interesting and topical things at the moment is whether, for example, gas and nuclear should be included in Europe's definition of green taxonomy. I think the gas one's interesting. So if you look at it, let's look beyond the borders of Europe, but say, it seems to me that gas is a green transition asset and can be very positive if it's being used to displace thermal coal electricity generation, for example. So you may argue that gas is green if applied in China, but it's not green if applied in Europe, where Europe there probably is the level of wealth and commitment to move to a wholly renewable energy set that can exclude fossil fuels. So again, we've got to be really careful about the context in which we're trying to make these decisions, and then we can go on and talk about, as I said earlier, one of the things we think a lot about is tax policy, and so that's really a developed world thing. But how is it okay for some companies to have effectively managed to not pay tax for many years? That doesn't seem a sustainable position. It's definitely not in the interest of society. How should we go about focusing on those types of issues for much more advanced companies and economies?
Yeah, that makes sense. And you really had this important point of, the system and the context are really important in terms of what matters most. I mean, in terms of ESG. I wanted to go back to one point as we discussed more, this key finding we had in terms of, this alignment, between investors and corporates. I mean, a large majority of asset owners and companies in our survey believe that existing ESG metrics are fit for purpose and meet their needs. But isn't there this kind of risk that, as you mentioned, that, that we need to look at systems as the context, we need to look at real world impact. Is there this risk that, kind of investors and companies are in some kind of echo chamber in terms of, thinking about ESG metrics?
Yes, it's a risk. I think it's important here, though, that the danger in a conversation like this is it comes off as being very critical of the efforts that people are making to improve and embed ESG into decision making. And so I think it's worth highlighting that I'm very much in the camp that says, let's find the positive in all of this. We're seriously now, most people are seriously now trying to embark on a journey to a better place in terms of the E and the S in particular. With that as context, yes, arguably there is a bit of an echo chamber. So this is this point about what does fitness for purpose mean. On the company side, I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. We do see reasonably good disclosure in most places on a number of useful metrics. I think things like the TCFD has been very useful, and in some countries, obviously, that's being enforced, and others not yet. In Europe, SFDR is a big deal. I think it's quite interesting how regulators, for example, are going about trying to influence how people are thinking about ESG metrics. So, not trying to be too prescriptive about how to implement this stuff, but trying to create a sort of transparency and enable people to make decisions around how they want to allocate capital. So I don't know, does that mean we're in an echo chamber? It runs the risk of being in an echo chamber. What I really wouldn't like to see is, thoughtless approaches to investing which simply tick the easy to measure boxes, and then we all go off and sort of content ourselves that we've solved that problem and can move on to the next one. I mean, something I'm very confident in is that taken in isolation, those commonly disclosed ESG metrics are not going to be enough to guide capital to where it needs to be to create a just carbon transition.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, so really looking at the bigger picture and the transparency, and you mentioned earlier the importance that we need to look beyond ESG metrics really and see what are they really for. They are kind of a starting point. And one of the things we looked at in the survey is related to that, which is about kind of who actually is in charge of the metrics that are measured and that are considered material. I mean, who do you believe should be deciding which metrics are material for ESG related reporting within an organization? Just for context, in our survey in the UK and the US, the CEO was identified for half of companies as the one who should make those decisions. And in APAC, it's actually the chief sustainability officer. 60% said it should be the chief sustainability officer. Who do you believe should be in charge of these?
Yeah, I scratched my head a bit on that too. I mean, the simple answer is I think it should be the chief exec. It's hard to see how a company will properly prioritize the relevant ESG targets and behaviors within its own context if it's not coming from the CEO. I mean, a lot of this is about incentives. It possibly even goes beyond the CEO because the board determines the CEO's priorities in many ways. So maybe we actually have to go a step beyond that. But in principle, so this, what is a chief sustainability officer? I don't for a minute want to suggest that's not a way to go about tackling this. But a chief sustainability officer without teeth is going to find it very difficult to influence meaningfully into the behaviors of a company. So they need to be, if it's not the chief exec, it needs to be someone who seriously has the ear of the chief exec and can influence how the chief exec is behaving and what incentives get placed within a company. This alignment of interest point, I think, really matters. And so one interesting, the way we would think about that is it doesn't even necessarily have to be that your chief exec has ESG metrics within their incentive structures, because in the long run, correctly embedding ESG considerations into running a company is, in our belief, likely to result in better outcomes for the company anyway. So if you actually have that very long-term alignment between investors and the chief exec of a company and cascading down there into the company, I think actually you can encourage responsible behavior without necessarily having to make, some sort of artificial carbon target as a determinant of somebody's bonus in any given year or something like that. So a lot of this is about alignment and timescales. But ultimately, it's got to come from the top of the company. Otherwise, I just don't see how it can really be implemented effectively. Well, actually, one other thing. You also have to bear in mind that typically the chief exec of a company will be in the shop window, so to speak. And that's very relevant for things like employees and people who want to work in a firm. If you want to attract really good talent in your firm and keep really good talent in your firm, I think, let's not pretend people are interested in where they have to live and what they're going to be remunerated. But there is increasingly another angle to this, which is chief exec leading by example in terms of the culture and beliefs of an organization in order to attract really good people who increasingly do care about purpose besides just turning up at work every day.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and just highlights that this is something that is really needs to be part of company culture. And this is also something that we found in our study, how important company culture is in terms of really embracing ESG and what ESG means for real world impact. Just briefly, we had a really interesting question, and this is a topic in its own right and could be discussed for a whole hour. But there was a question from the audience that came in: will ESG survive rising energy and inflation pressures? And in a way, that speaks to the conversation we had earlier about the context, right? In which ESG happens. But what's your view on that?
Yes, I think ESG factors are now fully embedded into people's thinking. I don't see it going away because of inflation and rising energy prices. Those do pose problems, but I think they're solvable without turning our attention away from this renewed focus on ESG, and that's a good thing. I think there's a commonality now of sort of responsible practices and company and investment success, and so there's no need for people to turn away from ESG because there's a bit of short-term pressure, perhaps, on corporate costs or whatever. I mean, kind of the point here is we want to see inflation in energy prices, for example, don't we? The whole point of inflation in energy prices is it drives people to invest more heavily in cheaper forms of energy. So if we take that in isolation, we're already living in a world where renewable energy, particularly solar, is, I was going to say price competitive with fossil fuels, but it's actually right now, is probably considerably cheaper than fossil fuels. So we have to look at it. It's not a case of ESG surviving, it's a case of energy and inflation pressures quite probably driving a greater commitment, certainly on some elements where there's now much more of an incentive for companies to shift to renewables, which are now cheaper. And in some ways, this is where ESG metric approaches to ESG become a success. The point of the exercise is to influence long-run behaviours such that we can reduce carbon emissions in this particular case. And I would actually see energy price inflation ultimately as being potentially quite beneficial to that whole process. And of course, we talk about energy because it's easy, but you can adopt similar logic to things like much cheaper approaches to healthcare and cleaner and more localized ways of producing food. We're into a world of vertical farms and synthetic biology and artificial intelligence and all sorts of stuff, which will probably thrive in an inflationary environment in which there's a greater imperative to find cheaper and better ways to do things.
Yeah, that makes sense. And actually it highlights again what you mentioned earlier in terms of the time horizon. I mean, if you look in the long run, prices might actually come down because of all of that innovation in climate technology, for example, or even healthcare and other related areas because of a focus on ESG. But in the interest of time, let's move to the really important section as well, which is about from metrics to stewardship, and that is obviously something that you're very passionate about. And what we found in the surveys was that close to 9 in 10 investors agree that direct engagement with companies is vital to the implementation of ESG agendas that would drive system-wide change. And we mentioned the importance of that system-wide change earlier. I mean, what is Baillie Gifford's stewardship strategy in achieving real-world impact?
Yeah, so I mean, this is almost the most crucial part of this conversation. So, I can certainly explain what we do, but I would argue that for many firms, this is of much broader applicability. It is really important to meet with the management of your companies on a fairly regular basis. You have to find a happy medium. They don't want to see you every week. Our job is not to try and run people's companies for them. Our job is to try and invest in companies that have great management. And that does bring us to I think, an often misunderstood element of stewardship. I don't really think stewardship is about fiercely holding management to account or even boards. That's part of it, and it needs to form part of it. But actually, I think, well, certainly for a firm like ours, we don't have to invest in every company. So we don't have to invest in a bad company and then harass them to get better. We just try and invest in decent companies with good management, and that's a luxury in some sense. And if we can do that, then we can build positive relationships with management. We can encourage them to be long-term. In some ways, we ignore them we push them to ignore desires of other short-term shareholders. We try and agree priorities with them, and we follow up with them on a consistent basis over a number of years as to whether those stewardship priorities are being implemented. And then I also think, there's almost two different questions depending on the company. What's important for a company in terms of its ESG and impact on the world? Is it how it conducts itself? Or is it, as we talked a little bit about earlier, is it the goods and services that it provides into the world that have the potential to tackle E&S issues? And so we try and focus on what's most material in the case of each individual companies. And this is really resource intensive. So, I think it's kind of like we have to just recognize that this is resource intensive. I'm not sure everyone wants to face up to this. If you are going to be meaningful, responsible owners and stewards of capital with regards to all the investments you make, I think that can't really be reduced to writing letters and ticking boxes. I think you have to get into the weeds with individual companies, and that takes a lot of people. Weirdly enough, I would never ever advocate for higher fees in asset management. I think often fees are too high, but we do have to recognise that there comes a point when, if you do want really meaningful, effective stewardship activity, then it actually has to be paid for. And I think some of the passive managers, for instance, actually have my sympathies in this, because people want to pay next to nothing for passive, but they're also piling on the pressure for passive managers to be stewards of the thousands of companies that they've got investments in. We can all do with stepping back a wee bit and thinking about the realities of that, in my view.
Yeah, that's a great point. And you mentioned how important it is to look beyond that kind of box ticking exercise and really looking at what is material, the opportunity as well that comes from better management. And this is also one of the the key findings from our study, which is that shift from perceived risk to the investment opportunities that come from ESG. So I wanted to ask you as well, how is this kind of narrative around ESG changing in your view in terms of from this kind of risk to investment opportunity?
I think it is changing. I would like to think now, in fact, that it's fairly widely accepted, not everywhere, but widely accepted, that irresponsible corporate behaviour normally leads to a bad place for shareholders. So we may be getting to a place where the direct risks from how a company conducts itself are quite well understood, and that no longer has to be the meat of the conversation. What are the risks from your behaviour? I'm not sure even I believe this, but let's be optimistic and say that maybe that conversation's already happened in most places. Although there is this danger that we may come onto, is that we just drive people into private and out of the public eye. But anyway, leaving that for a minute, I think we are moving to investment opportunity. It might be worth, I'm just thinking about where do the likes of ESG scorers fit into this. I think they can be useful because they drive companies to have longer term policy on the whole are more ESG friendly. And there's probably a slightly tangential point here, which I think as ESG has embedded itself in investment thinking, the whole industry is becoming longer term. And that's a positive thing in an industry which has been pretty short term for many years, fixated on quarterly earnings and things. It's a little bit oblique, but ESG is making the investment industry better. As they become longer term, the focus turns away from short term risks and more towards long term opportunities. And so I think this is ultimately having a very positive effect on capital deployment and wealth creation, which, let's remember, is what we're actually supposed to be here for. So if we move to this sort of opportunity space as opposed to do no harm space from an ESG point of view, we are looking for opportunities for technological and structural solutions that can move the dial. So, we get to things like what are the opportunities from distributed power generation, carbon technologies. We talked earlier about healthcare, green hydrogen, all of these types of things, which become ESG opportunities as opposed to ESG risks. And I think that's a really positive. I think we're making great progress towards that. In fact, I hope we are.
Brilliant. That's good to hear. And as you mentioned, it's this longer term focus that is increasingly important. There's one controversial topic in this space. That's if you look at what's happening in the ESG space and in the investment space is this topic of divestment. There's a lot of push sometimes by activists investors, by civil society groups for divestment. And it's a controversial topic, of course. I mean, the one question from the audience that came in before the webinar is, the Economist highlighted in a recent issue the pitfalls of divestment, while Bailey Gifford has been keen to promote the effectiveness of engagement rather than divestment. And we have talked about the importance of engagement just now. So is there any value to divestment at all? What do you think, Stuart?
Be careful, because there may be clients of ours who require us to have exclusions, and therefore, I want to be inclusive in my answer here. I do not think that divestment is a particularly impactful approach to requiring companies to improve their operational practices. However, you can only go as far as your audience will let you. And what I mean by that is, if you're running a pension scheme and the members of your pension scheme don't sit thinking about this stuff all day, they just think, I don't want you to invest in fossil fuel companies because they're contributing to climate change. It would be very easy for me to say, but that's overly simplistic. Gas companies may play a role in a green hydrogen revolution, and you should be more thoughtful. I'm not sure how constructive that is. I'm much more in the camp that says, let's have a big tent on our ESG journey. If some people, even though I may think it's less effective, if some people want to have exclusions-based approaches, at least we're thinking about it, at least we're trying to do the right things. And over the course of time, perhaps as we're able to adopt more sophisticated approaches to, in the broadest sense, responsible investing, then things like divestment probably we probably better understand that they're relatively blunt tools. And then there is, I guess, there's a regulation really has a role to play here, because I sadly think there will always be a marginal buyer for even the dirtiest of assets. So we see assets that pension funds or people don't want to own in the public space can be very easily taken private, whereas we said they're sort of out of sight, out of mind, and may even be operated in a less responsible way than they had been. So one of the things we need to think about here is we can't regulate for more responsible investing purely by things like listing rules. We need some regulation here that captures pretty much the whole system. Otherwise, maybe at that point, divestment actually does become more useful because nobody will be buyers. But fundamentally, we'd rather engage most of the time.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, we highlighted the benefits of engaging more. I mean, if you really want to have real world impact, where divestment is quite blunt, as you said. And you mentioned the importance of regulation. We have this, this big focus on improving disclosure and engagement in our study as well. So actually, it's actually a good segue to a question I had on regulation, and that's also kind of a forward-looking question. I mean, do you believe regulators should set out more binding rules on the disclosure and measuring of real-world impact, as opposed to kind of the current more kind of voluntary or comply or explain models?
Yes, in principle, but no in practice might be the sort of slightly pathetic answer to that one. I think you can try to impose upon companies to disclose real-world impact in a thoughtful and analytical way, rather than simple, easily measured metrics. The scope for interpretation within something like that is so immense that it might just not be practical for companies to do that. I don't think you're going to see lots of companies self-disclosing that they have a terrible impact on the world, regardless of what the rules say. And I doubt it's possible to write rules that would different outcome to that. So maybe this is where the hard data points that are required in some places in the accounting standards that people are working on do have a role to play, because that's sort of at least quasi-regulatory, as long as people understand that that is just the starting point for a discussion. And, in some ways, this is this regulatory approach of transparency facilitating consumer choice, whether that's through investment funds or whether it's through from whom people decide to buy products, is I actually think regulators have been fairly smart in how they are trying to push people down this road of disclosure and transparency, rather than create binding rules, which I think would be unlikely to ultimately achieve what they're trying to do. I mean, one of the worst possible outcomes, I think, from all of this is you create artificial targets around ESG and responsible behaviour. An ESG industry, we hit our own RT targets, but actually we kind of lose sight entirely of the underlying goal of all this, which is the greater challenge around the development of the environment and sort of social equality. Sorry, that's quite a woolly answer, but I think the sort of the summary of that is simply it kind of comes back to this point of there is no substitute for company by company understanding within a systems-wide perspective of how do these companies actually impact the real world. I think it's just very hard to try and create a set of rules around that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's really about where can regulations provide better incentives for something that corporates and investors are working towards anyway, which should be, as you mentioned, the real world impact. And one area that is...
Sorry, Martin, I was just going to say one other thing. Apologies. There's an example actually of how the dangers of gaming the system. I mean, I think if you now look at how companies have reacted to third-party ESG scorers who are well motivated in trying to guide people to do the right thing, what we've actually seen is loads of companies who are not necessarily in particularly either green industries or particularly well behaved within their own industries creating policies because they know how the ESG scores work. So if you don't have a wastewater management policy, you'll be marked down in your ESG score. So you create the policy without any real regard for how you're implementing it or what practice that's having. So the point I'm trying to make here is that well-intended creation of fairly rigid rules, I think we're already seeing examples of companies gaming that system to get some sort of green badge that they actually don't merit. So we really need to guard against that becoming more widespread.
Yeah, that's such a huge risk, as you mentioned, the danger of gaming the system and creating those kind of artificial targets that don't actually help to with this kind of system-wide improvement. We discussed earlier the divestment as a kind of controversial topic. I mean, there's also the question around how investors can engage with companies in those kind of really hard to abate sectors, and the divestment question often comes up in those hard to abate sectors, from transport or construction and of course energy. So in your view, how can investors engage with companies in these hard to abate sectors in order to kind of discourage companies from offloading difficult assets onto kind of these less scrutinized privately held entities? And you mentioned earlier the importance of regulation. Can regulation help with that?
Yeah, so I think that's an absolutely crucial question, and this is where I'd like to see some of the regulatory focus falling, because it really matters as a part of the jigsaw that we have to put in place here. So the way we would think about this in our firm, we do in some strategies invest in what I call necessary but polluting sectors. So whether that's mining or whatever, what we try to do in those sectors is invest in best in practice companies. So those companies that are doing necessary but polluting things, but in the least damaging way possible. So the classic example of this would be, who's digging up the copper and iron ore that we need to build the wind turbines? We can't just not do that. It's a key component of the carbon transition. So we do invest in a mining company. We think they're best in class. They're committed to operating as well as they can in what is a fundamentally difficult environment to not create some environmental damage. We wouldn't normally invest in a company where we thought their incentive or they were short-term such they would just sell the asset to a private business. The problem is, if a private owner has the opportunity to operate a dirty asset more cheaply because they're not under public scrutiny, then it's going to be quite hard for a public company to turn down what will likely be a higher offer for an asset than they can generate from it by operating it themselves in the public eye. That seems rather convoluted, but I think the logic is sound. It creates an opportunity for regulatory arbitrage. So this is where I think actually lawyers really, regulators have to think about it. But I am no regulator or lawyer, but maybe there's a way to discourage that by legislating to leave behind some exposure to environmental take costs or something if you sell a dirty asset. Remember, of course, that legislation to do that is likely to raise the prices of whatever depends on the dirty asset. So it might be energy prices is the most obvious example. So if governments do create tighter legislation to prevent the irresponsible operation of dirty assets, they're probably also going to have to take measures on the S of the ESG. So, for example, to make sure that energy prices remain affordable. And of course, governments can do that through tax and wealth transfers. But it's a really complex question. But yes, I think it's really important that we do something. Again, it's back to this. If you just do it through a public listing set of rules, you're not really going to solve the problem.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you highlighted that, when you do something on the E, you have all these kind of S considerations and G consideration as well. I mean, what is the social and governance implication of, environmental impact and the focus on environmental indicators? We have an audience question here that is interesting, and it's kind of broadly also linked to the topic of kind of how does this apply in different contexts, I mean, geographical and otherwise. Do you think ESG practices can be standardized across countries and sectors globally? And how practical is this for SMEs, so kind of small and medium-sized?
Yeah. I'll start by saying I think it might even be quite dangerous if ESG practices were to be standardized across countries and particularly sectors. And yes, we can't impose too much on SMEs. I want to go back to a comment you made as you asked the question about the G. We've not spoken very much about G today. And I think it is important to work out where does that fit. If you always go back to the question about how should we emphasize each one of those, the way that we would think about the G is much more, it's the construct that allows the E&S decisions to be made. So I'm just sort of cognizant that talking of E&S in isolation doesn't actually get us very far. These policies can only be implemented if you have a board who is suitably aligned, as we discussed, and trying to put in place these policies that then facilitate responsible. So I just want to make the point that kind of underlies all of this. Companies can't do any of this if they don't have the correct decision makings on the G to let it happen. Anyway, back to the why is it dangerous to standardize ESG practices? I think what's material for one sector is not material for another sector often, and even within a sector, what's material in one place may not be so material in another place, because it depends on things like local regulations. If you try and impose rigid standards which are very high cost or impractical, then probably you don't achieve a lot of progress, because we just see more companies fail, or we see a drop in investment and wealth creation, and I don't think that can be the policy goal here. So there probably are some disclosures that can be standardized where they're fairly universal and basic things, like we mentioned safety standards, fair labor practices, some form of limits on pollution. But as soon as you get into those kind of standardized, what do you do with limits on pollution? If you can't equally implement that across countries, you're right into a political debate about how does a government get elected if it's in a democracy and it's imposing costs on society that the next door government isn't imposing. It gets really, really difficult. So it's the sort of the art of the practical. I think, I think the answer to the how do we solve this question, rather than imposing, there are some rules we can impose, but as I said, it takes you into a world of carbon taxes, and if you're in carbon taxes, you're probably going to need border taxes so that companies can't export their emissions. All of that needs to be thought about and looked at. But there's almost a simpler answer to this, in my opinion, which is if you look at it through the lens of transparency and research and development spending in companies and governance and technological transformation, then that's probably where you're going to find the answers. That's where you're going to find you can get people to moderate their behavior by offering them equally good ways of doing things that are less polluting. I suspect that's where the answer lies, rather than this kind of imposing standardized ESG practices, which can lead you to some quite difficult places.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you mentioned how important it is to differentiate that what's material in one place or one context might not be viewed as material in another. So it's important to have that differentiated view without forgetting that system-wide and regulatory approaches are needed to have some kind of common standards. Stuart, I mean, it's been amazing to talk with you. I mean, it's such an exciting topic. I mean, we could probably go on forever. It's so exciting to talk about the findings of the study we have done, supported by Bailey Gifford. And obviously, thanks so much, Stuart, for all of your great insights. I mean, we've learned a lot about, the need to look beyond ESG metrics. I mean, there is, that importance of, a strong ESG agenda, the long-term strategy. Metrics in a way are aligning. There's consolidation happening, as we have spoken about, but ESG metrics definitely are not the silver bullets. It's not the one and only solution. There needs to be transparency, better reporting, a bottom-up approach. We talked a lot, Stuart, we talked a lot about engagement and the need to have this differentiated approach, looking at what's material in one context might not be in another. But at the same time, there's also a role for these kind of binding requirements, regulations, to kind of move forward, track progress, to really make the investor stewardship relationship and program, aligned with these targets for kind of real world impact that we need to see. So thanks a lot again, Stuart. And as you know, the findings from the study can be found on our website, impact.economist.com. The link to the full research results are here under the resources tab. Thanks a lot again, and hope to speak with you again soon about ESG metrics and the future of engagement.